It's Valentine's Day, which means, of course, it's time for us to get geeky. Specifically, how did the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, criminals on criminals, give rise to us losing Second Amendment rights? Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this history lesson because the anti-gunners keep repeating this game plan. We want to stop them. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of Disarming, What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so happy Valentine's Day. And because it's Valentine's Day, we in the Second Amendment community know exactly what we need to be doing, which of course is learning about the Second Amendment and our love for it. So today I want to talk about a theme to touch his fingers with Valentine's Day, because indeed, Valentine's Day, believe it or not, has played a role in our Second Amendment community. Specifically, this is how we lost the right to keep and bear machine guns under the National Firearms Act. We'll talk about that in more detail in 1 second. But just to go back in time, in the year of our Lord, 1929, in Chicago, a bunch of gangbanger thugs, violent thugs, psychopathic gangsters, fighting over turf, gave rise to what is now known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. So this was gang-on-gang violence. These were scumbag-on-scumbag violence. Nothing to do with innocent Americans or law-abiding Americans or ordinary Americans or anything like this. Scumbag-on-scumbag violence. The thing is, during this situation, which gave rise to 7 members of one of the gangs, the Chicago North Side Gang, were murdered. St. Valentine's Day, 1929, in the morning. They were shot by 4 individuals, 2 of whom were disguised apparently as police officers. But this again was just gang-on-gang crime, fighting over turf in the city of Chicago. Okay. What was tricky about this ultimately is that this violent crime was used, or the people that perpetrated it used 2 Thompson submachine guns. Submachine guns. So because this crime was so widely publicized in the 1920s and early 1930s, the Thompson submachine gun became known as a gangster weapon and crime-related. Sound familiar? Well, it should. Because again, the anti-gun community back in the 1920s and 1930s, the progressive movement back then and the progressive movement today, by the way, they want to link guns with the acts of bad actors and blame the guns. And that's what happened in the early part of the 20th century. Because after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, guess what happened? In 1932, terrible president. We don't like him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. No good for a bunch of reasons we can go into multiple videos, but we don't have to get into it right now. The bottom line is Democratic president, progressive Franklin Delano Roosevelt got elected in 1932, and him and Roosevelt and his government did a bunch of bad things to America. One of the bad things they did was in 1934, they pushed through the National Firearms Act. Now, I should let you know, and this is where we should give accolades and applauding to the NRA, when the National Firearms Act was being negotiated in Congress, which at some point we should do a whole video on this, but we don't need to right now. Of course, it was discussed, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was discussed, and they tried to point out that these, Thompson guns, Tommy guns, that were used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, highly publicized violent crime, these should basically be banned. So in the National Firearms Act, they imposed, as you know, a $200 tax on these. You could still own them, but of course it was cost prohibitive to do so. It was so bad at the time that gun dealers that possessed these Thompson submachine guns were trying to give them away because they didn't want to have to pay the tax on these guns because the tax was so prohibitive and expensive. So it really was caused quite a stir. But all this sort of anti-American can't have machine guns. And again, the Thompson machine gun was viewed as a smaller, lightweight machine gun, but somehow in the drafting of this bill by Congress, they included all machine guns, including the heavy-duty ones, which were never tied to any crimes at all, just these submachine guns. But again, the lesson here is even in the 1920s, the anti-gun movement was trying to take away our Second Amendment rights because of the acts of criminals and criminal on criminal violence. Now, we have to applaud the NRA here because in the original draft of the National Firearms Act, handguns, believe it or not, were included as an NFA item. And thank God, thanks to the lobbying efforts of the National Rifle Association, handguns were pulled out of the final National Firearms Act. So that was a great win to get handguns out. Thank God they didn't get put in there, or who knows where we would be today in America. But they did not, and history has worked out in our favor in that regard. But let us carry on. So again, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the excuse, a major excuse for the National Firearms Act. It was all about, hey, we need to take these guns away from criminals, even though only a few of them were ever involved in any crimes. But again, the high-profile nature was used by Congress and FDR and the progressive Democrats to try to take away our Second Amendment rights, and they wanted to go a lot further, but they did not think they could do so because of the Second Amendment, and the lobbying of the NRA helped considerably. Now, as you know, we know that the Founding Fathers thought that this kind of approach was stupid. The reason why we know that is if you go back to 1791 when they adopted the Second Amendment, they specifically wrote the Second Amendment. Now, never forget, and don't forget this, the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights is the ultimate historical document in favor of our right to keep and bear arms. The anti-gun movement in America wants to simply make a reference to the Second Amendment and immediately start discussing guns are good and bad, or they want to talk about historical gun laws. They immediately want to talk about that stuff. But the reality is the most powerful historical evidence that our founding fathers viewed the right to keep and bear arms as a fundamental right on par with all the other fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights is the fact that they wrote and included the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Very powerful evidence. And relatedly, remember we've talked about how the dog that did not bark in the night, or that silence speaks volumes. At the same time, our founding fathers were adopting affirmatively the Second Amendment, which protects a pre-existing right? The right to keep and bear arms is a pre-existing right that existed even without the adoption of the Second Amendment. And that's why the Second Amendment is written the way it's written, i.e., the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You see how the text works there? The right of the people to keep and bear arms is a statement. It exists. The right exists. And all the Second Amendment does is add the words shall not be infringed, basically saying the existing right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed in the future. That's all it says. Now, of course, the silence that speaks volumes, or the dog did not bark in the night, which is a reference to a famous Sherlock Holmes story by Arthur Conan Doyle. The fact is that if you go back to 1791 and you look at the relevant for any gun control laws, they're very, very few. Very, very few, which is entirely consistent with a group of our founding fathers that thought it was an affirmative right, on the one hand with the Second Amendment, and then obviously the fact that no gun laws were adopted is the silence, the lack of gun laws, affirms the meaning and the power of the Second Amendment. So all this is put together to show that this is what the founders understood. Nevertheless, when you get into the 20th century, you start to see the rise of the progressive movement and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a terrible president for 1,000 reasons. We don't need to get into, but terrible president. Put that on your list of things to understand. And FDR tried to take away the rights of Americans in a whole host of ways by expanding the scope of the federal government, by imposing all these regulations, by deferring to experts and not we the people, right? They wanted the smartest people in the room to tell us what to do instead of we the people tell us what to do and govern ourselves, and a shift, of course, to a much different kind of federal government than we ever had prior to the rise of FDR. Nevertheless, the key here to understand is, again, even in the early 20th century, the anti-gun movement was desperately trying to take guns away from Americans, and the way they did it was to publicize and to highlight and to exploit high-profile crimes to take away our rights. But this violates not just the Founding Fathers understand the role of the Second Amendment, it also violates the most basic premise of Cesare Beccaria, that famous Italian criminologist that we've talked about before, who was writing before the American Revolution, who was writing before the Declaration of Independence, and was writing before the Second Amendment, and yet our founding fathers like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson read all about the works and read all of the works of Cesare Beccaria, and he spoke very specifically to the importance of arms among law-abiding and not to allow the acts of criminals to disarm the law-abiding, because that is just a bad public policy. And that was, again, Italian Enlightenment philosopher Cesare Beccaria, who wrote the following that our founding fathers not only knew about, they literally wrote about repeatedly at the time of the founding. Specifically, this is what Cesare Beccaria writes. False is the idea of utility that sacrifices 1,000 real advantages for one imaginary or trifling inconvenience, that would take fire from men because it burns, and water because one may drown in it, that has no remedy for evils except destruction. The laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature. They disarm those only who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Can it be supposed that those who have the courage to violate the most sacred laws of humanity, the most important of the code, will respect the less important and arbitrary laws which can be violated with ease and impunity, and which, if strictly obeyed, would put an end to personal liberty? So dear to men, so dear to the enlightened legislator, and subject innocent persons to all the vexations that the guilty alone ought to suffer. Such laws, and this is very important to understand, such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man. Powerful language from Cesar Beccaria, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, and others all understood this work. Point being that using violent, terrible crimes by gangbangers, terrorists, thugs, nut jobs, psychos, whatever, to take away my right to keep and bear arms and your right to keep and bear arms is simply un-American and unconstitutional. But again, we must know this history. This is how we got the National Firearms Act. The excuse was we must not allow these gangbangers to continue to do things like the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, an excuse to take away Americans' gun rights. And the anti-gun movement in America continues to try to exploit violent crimes by violent thugs and psychopaths even to this day. And it's important for we in the Second Amendment community to understand that this is what happens, and we must be on guard and not duped by the anti-gun playbook. Okay? All right, folks. Well, have a happy Valentine's Day, and we will talk to you soon. Don't forget to follow me on X at 4 Boxes Diner, and we will see you again soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.